in the dark, damp archives of Fulda Abbey, a secret waited to be uncovered. It was a secret so well hidden that even the monks who had lived and died within its walls for centuries had forgotten its existence. The secret was a cartulary, a collection of ancient documents that told the story of a powerful family and their connection to the monastery. This family was none other than the ancestors of Hrabanus Maurus, the great scholar, abbot, and bishop. Imagine a world where family ties and land ownership were the keys to power. In the early medieval period, these things were everything. Hrabanus Maurus, born to Waluram and Waltrat, was no exception. His family's legacy was woven into the fabric of the monastery, but it was a legacy that had been carefully buried in the pages of the Cartulary. The Cartulary, a book of deeds and donations, was supposed to be a straightforward record of the monastery's land and property, but it was more than that. It was a puzzle, a complex web of connections that revealed the deep bonds between the monastery and the families who supported it. One of the most intriguing sections of this Cartulary was the 10th part, known as Lage the 10th, which contained the secrets of Hrabanus's family. Hrabanus's parents, Waluram and Waltrat, were prominent figures in the region. They had donated land to the monastery in 788, a gesture that not only secured their own salvation, but also laid the foundation for their son's future. Hrabanus had a nephew named Gundrahm, who was a priest and possibly a monk at Fulda. But beyond these few known relatives, the sources were silent. The Cartulary, however, held the key to uncovering more. The Cartulary was organized by geographical areas, or lagen, and each lage contained charters from a specific region. The 11th lage, or Lage the 10th, was unique. It was not organized by location, but by the people it mentioned. The first 4 charters in this section were all donations made by Waluram, Hrabanus's father. These charters were not just about land. They were about the family's legacy and their relationship with the monastery. One of the most significant charters in Lage the 10th was a donation made by Waluram in 802. It included properties in the Rheingau, Mainz, and the Wormsgau. Another charter from 788 detailed a conditional donation of a townhouse in Mainz and a donation of Waltrat's property in the Wormsgau. A third charter from 763 mentioned a donation in the Lobdingau, a region across the Rhine from the Wormsgau. These charters were all part of a single story, a story of a family's deep connection to the land and the monastery. The Cartulary also revealed other members of Hrabanus's family. His brother, Guntram, and his sister, Meginrada, were mentioned in the 788 donation. Guntram, in particular, appeared in many other charters, often in close proximity to Waluram and Hrabanus. This suggested that the family's influence extended beyond the immediate donations and into the broader community. But the Cartulary was more than just a record of land transactions. It was a reflection of the monastery's identity. Hrabanus's family was not just a family. They were part of a larger community bound together by the monastery. The Cartulary showed how the monastery's land and the family's legacy were intertwined, creating a web of relationships that spanned generations. The organization of the Cartulary, as proposed by the scholar Stengel, was based on a strict topographical and chronological scheme. However, the unique structure of Lage the 10th suggested that the monks who compiled the Cartulary had a different purpose in mind. They wanted to preserve the memory of Hrabanus's family and their contributions to the monastery. In the 11th Lage, the charters were divided into 5 numbered sections, each containing charters that were grouped by their connections to Hrabanus's family. This organization was a deliberate choice, a way to embed the family's legacy within the Cartulary. The copyists who wrote these charters were familiar with the people they described and knew their significance. The Cartulary of Fulda Abbey was not just a record of land and property. It was a living document that told the story of a family and their deep connection to the monastery. Hrabanus Maurus's family was at the heart of this story, and their legacy was carefully preserved in the pages of the Cartulary. The secret of their past was waiting to be discovered, hidden in the ancient documents of Fulda Abbey. In the 9th century, the monastery of Fulda was a bustling center of religious and social activity. One of the most intriguing parts of its history can be found in a section of its Cartulary, a book where important documents and records were kept. This section, known as Lage the 10th, is a treasure trove of information about a prominent family and their connections to the monastery. Waluram, the father of Hrabanus, was a significant figure in the region. The charters in Lage X reveal that Waluram owned properties across several districts, including Mainz, Wormsgau, Rheingau, Lubdingau, and Nehegau. These districts were all close to each other in the mid-Rhine area, and it was where Hrabanus's family held their estates. The monks who compiled the Cartulary placed Waluram's charters in a special section, showing how important his family was to the monastery. Waluram was not just Hrabanus's father. He was also one of Fulda's most generous patrons in the late 8th century. He first appears in 756 as a witness to a donation in Dromersheim, and later, in 788, he made his own donation there. Over the years, Waluram became a regular figure in the monastery's records, witnessing many transactions between 772 and 802. His last recorded donation was in 802, when he gave 5 properties to the monastery, including one in Mainz, a church in Hofheim, and 3 locations in the Wormsgau. He died the same year, leaving behind a legacy of generosity and piety. Waluram's relationship with the monastery was further strengthened by his son, Hrabanus, who was offered to the monastery as an oblate, a child dedicated to monastic life. Despite this dedication, Hrabanus's ties to his family were not severed. In 788, Waluram and his wife, Waltratt, made a donation of a property in Mainz, which they and Hrabanus were allowed to use until their deaths. This donation suggests that even after Hrabanus joined the monastery, he maintained a connection to his family's properties and heritage. Lage X also includes charters from Hrabanus's suspected brother, Count Guntram, and his nephew, Gundrahm. Guntram's charters, recorded in 841 and 834, show his significant donations of properties in the Nehegau and Wormsgau. The year 841 was particularly significant for Guntram and Hrabanus, as it was a time of political turmoil. Hrabanus was ousted from his position as abbot, and Guntram disappeared from historical records, possibly due to the Battle of Fontenoy in June 841. Guntram's donations in May 841 were likely motivated by a desire for salvation and protection in the face of these challenges. Gundrahm, who was probably a priest and a monk at Fulda, also made a donation in the 870s. His charters were added to Lage X, further cementing the family's connection to the monastery. Gundram's donation included properties in the Wormsgau and Nehegau, some of which were near places where his father, Guntram, had previously donated. The inclusion of these charters in Lage X shows how the monks at Fulda carefully preserved the memory of Hrabanus's family. It was a way to honor their contributions and to keep their legacy alive. The Cartulary was not just a record of transactions. It was a living document that wove together the stories of the monastery's patrons and their families. Kinship and memory were crucial in the early Middle Ages. The monks at Fulda were the keepers of these memories, recording and preserving the deeds and donations of the people who supported the monastery. These records were not just about property. They were about the spiritual and social connections that bound people together in the household of God. In this world, the lines between family and faith were often blurred. Hrabanus, his father Waluram, his brother Guntram, and his nephew Gundrahm were all part of a larger community that included the monks, the poor, and the saints. Their donations and the memories they left behind were a way to ensure their place in the eternal city of God, a vision that inspired both the living and the dead. In the world of early medieval Europe, the idea of family and genealogy was quite different from what we might think today. Imagine a time when people didn't keep detailed records of their ancestors like we do now. Instead, they had a different way of remembering and understanding their family history. This chapter explores how people in the early medieval period, especially in the Frankish world, thought about their families and how these ideas changed over time. To understand the Frankish approach to family history, it helps to look at a different culture. In Tang China, which existed around the same time, families often had detailed records of their ancestors. These records, called epitaphs, were inscribed on stones and could be very long, sometimes even 10,000 words. These epitaphs told the story of the family, going back many generations. They were a way for the family to remember their past and show their importance. In the Frankish world, things were quite different. The Franks, who lived in what is now France and Germany, didn't keep such detailed records. Instead, they had a more spiritual and religious way of thinking about family. They believed in a divine order, which meant that their family history was part of a larger plan set by God. This made their family memories less focused on detailed pedigrees and more on the roles their ancestors played in the world. The Carolingian era, named after the famous King Charlemagne, was a time of great change in Europe. During this period, the Frankish Empire was at its height, and the idea of family and kinship was closely tied to the political structure. The Carolingian rulers, like Charlemagne, were part of a dynasty, and their family connections were important for maintaining power and control. However, even in this period, the idea of family was not as detailed as in Tang China. Instead, it was more about alliances and the roles people played in the kingdom. For example, a nobleman might be remembered more for his loyalty to the king, or his contributions to the church rather than his exact family tree. As the Carolingian Empire began to break apart in the 9th and 10th centuries, the idea of family and kinship started to change. New kingdoms and principalities emerged, and the aristocracy began to develop a more defined sense of their own identity. This was a time when genealogical literature and images started to appear more frequently. These genealogical records were different from the detailed epitaphs of Tang China. They were more about showing the connections between noble families and their claims to power. For example, a noble family might create a genealogical chart to show their descent from a famous king or saint, which helped them justify their position in society. The church played a significant role in this period. Monasteries and churches were important centers of learning and record keeping. They often kept records of donations and land transactions, which sometimes included information about family connection. These records were not as detailed as the Tang epitaphs, but they still provide valuable insights into how families thought about their past. For example, the Cartulary of the Abbey of Fulda, a famous monastery in Germany, contains many records of land donations and transactions. These records often mention the names of donors and their families, giving us a glimpse into the social and family structures of the time. In the Frankish world, memory was a powerful tool. People remembered their ancestors through stories, songs, and oral traditions. These memories were not always written down, but they were passed down from generation to generation. This oral tradition helped to keep the family history alive, even if it was not as detailed as written record. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the idea of family and kinship had evolved. Genealogical literature and images became more common, especially in the form of family trees and histories. These works were often commissioned by noble families to document their lineage and reinforce their status. One example is the family of Hrabanus Maurus, a famous scholar and abbot from the 9th century. His family's history was recorded in various documents, including a cartulary that lists their donations and transactions. These records show how the family was connected to the church and how they maintained their status over several generations. The political changes of the period also influenced how families thought about their past. As the Carolingian Empire broke apart, new kingdoms and principalities emerged, each with its own noble families. These families had to adapt to the new political landscape, and their genealogical records reflect this change. For example, the Radoins and the Wolfold Gundoins were two noble families in the region of the Sargau. Their transactions and donations, recorded in the Cartulary of the Abbey of Weissenberg, show how they maintained their influence and connections over time. These records provide a window into the social and political dynamics of the period. In the early medieval period, the idea of family and genealogy was shaped by a unique combination of religious beliefs, political structures, and social customs. While the Frankish world did not have the detailed family records of Tang China, it had its own ways of remembering and understanding family history. As the period progressed, these ideas evolved, reflecting the changing political and social landscape of Europe. The emergence of genealogical literature and images in the High Middle Ages marked a significant shift in how families thought about their past and their place in the world. The work of historians Georges Duby and Carl Schmid has been incredibly influential in understanding how the noble families of the Central Middle Ages changed. They suggested that the early Middle Ages saw aristocratic families organized through both male and female lines, cognatic kin groups. But by the High Middle Ages, these families had transformed into lineages based on male descent patrilineages, and tied to specific places toponym. This idea sparked a lot of debate and research, but it also faced criticism from various angles. Some researchers found that women still played significant roles, even as male descent became more emphasized. Others noted that family names and places were not always consistent, and that kinship was more of a constructed idea than a fixed reality. One of the more lasting contributions of Carl Schmidt's work was his focus on how aristocrats perceived themselves and their families. He studied library memorials, books of memory, and genealogical literature from the late Carolingian period, which showed how noble families thought about their lineage and history. Georges Duby was inspired by this and called for more research on French genealogical literature, suggesting that it could reveal the family psychology and mental images behind noble lineages. In 1975, Leopold Jenicot published a significant work on genealogies, defining them as independent writings that show family relationships, but excluding other types of documents like histories or saints' lives. However, the initial excitement around genealogical research faded as scholars discovered that many genealogies were actually written by monks and clerics, not by the noble families themselves. This meant that these documents were not straightforward reflections of family traditions. For example, the famous Genealogia Welforum, which was thought to be a record of the Welf family, might not have been directly connected to the Welfs at all. Another issue was that the definition of genealogy was too narrow. Schmid and Duby were mainly interested in how genealogies reflected secular power and politics, but this approach overlooked the religious and cultural contexts in which these documents were created. Duby, for instance, saw genealogies as primarily about blood ties and secular families, while Jenicot defined genealogies as works that focused on family relationships, excluding other types of historical writings. Jenicot proposed a two-stage development of genealogical writings. Early genealogies were found among Celtic and Germanic peoples, and later, around 1050, aristocratic genealogies became more common. However, this model was challenged by David Dumville, who argued that there was no solid evidence for the early Germanic origins of genealogies. Instead, he suggested that these writings were often the work of clerics, and influenced by Christian and Latin scholarship. Further research by Dunchato Corrine showed that Irish genealogies, once thought to be unique and orally transmitted, were actually created by literate scholars in ecclesiastical schools. These scholars were inspired by the Bible and the works of Isidore of Seville, and their genealogies were deeply rooted in Christian and Latin traditions. When we broaden our understanding of genealogy beyond just blood ties and secular families, we see that the Middle Ages were filled with genealogical consciousness. Mitchell Sott and Gabrielle Spiegel expanded the concept of genealogy to include non-procreative lineages, and the way history was written in the 13th century. Spiegel noted that genealogies became a way to ground history in biological connections, transforming the way people understood the past and present. To understand the significance of having a genealogy in the Middle Ages, it's helpful to consider what it meant not to have one. The Bible presents figures like Melchizedek, who appears in Genesis as a priest without a known family. This made him a mysterious and powerful figure, often seen as a type of Christ. The book of Hebrews describes Melchizedek as without father, without mother, without genealogy, highlighting his eternal and divine nature. This idea influenced Christian thinkers, who saw the priesthood of Melchizedek as a model for the Christian priesthood, which was perpetuated through a mystical and unbroken lineage. Throughout the Middle Ages, scholars continue to discuss Melchizedek, emphasizing his unique status as a figure without a genealogy. This reflection on Melchizedek shows that genealogies were not just about family ties, but were deeply connected to religious and spiritual concepts. The absence of a genealogy was as meaningful as its presence, highlighting the complex and multifaceted nature of genealogical consciousness in medieval Europe. In the world of early medieval scholars, the story of Melchizedek and the genealogies of Jesus were more than just ancient texts. They were keys to understanding the divine plan and the nature of Christ. Melchizedek, a mysterious figure from the Old Testament, was seen as a prefigurement of Christ. His lack of a recorded genealogy was not a mere omission, but a profound symbol. According to Frecholf, a 9th century chronicler, the absence of Melchizedek's family tree highlighted the unique and divine nature of Christianity. Since Melchizedek had no recorded parents or ancestry, he was seen as a type of Christ, who, according to Christian belief, was both human and divine. Remigius of Auxerre, a 10th century theologian, emphasized that Melchizedek's lack of a genealogy was not a mistake, but a deliberate choice by the Holy Scriptures to show that he was a special figure. This was echoed by glosses on the Book of Hebrews, which noted that Melchizedek's origins were never explained, making him a symbol of eternity and divine mystery. Peter Damian, a prominent monk and theologian, highlighted that Melchizedek's introduction in the Old Testament by Moses, without any mention of his parents or ancestry, was a way to point to Christ. Christ, he argued, was both the King of justice and the King of peace, and like Melchizedek, he had no earthly genealogy because he was divine. Christ's unique role as both king and priest, and his eternal nature, were foreshadowed by Melchizedek. Peter Lombard, a leading theologian of the 12th century, synthesized the thoughts of earlier scholars like Jerome, Ambrose, and Remigius. He explained that Christ, like Melchizedek, was without father according to the flesh, and without mother according to divinity. This was because Christ's divine nature came from God, and his human nature came from his mother, Mary. Melchizedek, being a Gentile and not of Jewish descent, was a special type of Christ, showing that the priesthood did not originate with the Jews but was a universal concept. This meant that the Gentiles did not receive the priesthood from the Jews, but rather, the Jews received it from the Gentiles, as symbolized by Melchizedek. The concept of genealogy in the Bible was crucial for understanding the relationship between the human and divine. For medieval scholars, having a genealogy meant having a physical origin, a family, and a place in the material world. This was important because it showed the divine order embedded in the world. The genealogies of biblical figures, especially those of Jesus, were seen as the visible patterns of God's plan in history. The genealogy of Jesus, as recorded in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, presented a paradox. Matthew's genealogy traced Jesus' lineage forward from Abraham to Joseph, emphasizing his royal descent from David. Luke's genealogy, on the other hand, traced it backward from Jesus to Adam, emphasizing his divine origin. This discrepancy was a source of intense debate among early Christian scholars. Eusebius of Caesarea, a 4th century historian, proposed several solutions to these puzzles. He suggested that the genealogies were designed to hide Jesus' divine paternity from the devil, to protect Mary from scandal, and to follow the biblical custom of tracing descent through males. He also proposed that the differences in the genealogies were due to levirate marriage, where a man could marry his brother's widow to continue the family line. These explanations were further developed by later theologians like Augustine, Ambrose, Jerome, and Gregory the Great. They saw the genealogies as a blend of the natural and the mystical, the human and the divine. Matthew's genealogy, they argued, focused on Jesus' human ancestry, while Luke's genealogy focused on his divine origin. This duality was seen as a reflection of Jesus' dual nature, as both human and divine. The women mentioned in Matthew's genealogy, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, were also a source of interest. These women, who were considered sinners or foreigners, were included to show that Jesus came to save all people, not just the righteous or the chosen. This reinforced the idea that salvation was available to all, regardless of their past. Hrabanus Maurus, a prominent Carolingian scholar, explained that Matthew's genealogy, which traced Jesus' lineage forward, showed Christ's participation in human mortality and his descent into the world. Luke's genealogy, which traced Jesus' lineage backward to God, showed his ascent and the reconciliation of humanity with God. This dual perspective was seen as a reflection of the incarnation and the redemption. Christian of Stablo, another Carolingian scholar, used the 4 elements earth, water, fire, and air to explain the different focuses of the 4 Gospels. He saw Matthew's genealogy as rooted in the earth, representing the physical and historical aspects of Jesus' life. The genealogy, he argued, was a way to show how Christ, the new Adam, came to redeem the world and bring about a new beginning. In the end, the genealogies of Jesus were not just historical records, but profound theological statements. They showed how the divine and the human were intertwined in the person of Christ, and how the story of salvation was a story of both flesh and spirit. The medieval scholars saw in these genealogies a reflection of the deep mysteries of the Christian faith, where the eternal and the temporal, the divine and the human, came together in the life of Jesus.